We have another exciting session coming up. We've covered a lot of engineering, design earlier with Jean-Marc from Meta, and now we're jumping right into product by very accomplished founders. So we'll have Andrew O'Neill, who is a co-founder and former CPO, Chief Product Officer of Clearbit, a B2B go-to-market platform. And Andrew has a wealth of experience in building and scaling successful product teams, having led the product and design organization at Clearbit to drive the strategic product direction of the company. And before Clearbit, Andrew founded 2 B2C businesses, including SolidWise, which delivered millions of tutorials to product designers looking to improve their 3D modeling skills while the 3D printing boom was going on, which I'm sure many of you remember. And before that, he has worked in the film and television industry, working his way through production companies and talent agencies, as well as serving on the boards of several film festivals. And as is no surprise, in the session, he'll really share his insights and learnings, how to build your first product team, and how to scale your product vision to a world-class team and culture. Please give a warm welcome to Andrew.
I'm Andrew. I founded a company called Clearbit and was the chief product officer there, overseeing product and design. Today, I wanted to talk about building your first product team and really just building and scaling product culture at a company. I kind of want to start with a bit of a confession, which I think if I were to go back and talk to myself from 8 years ago, let's say, and I said, hey, I'm headed to Romania, I'm speaking at this really cool thing, and I think I'm going to talk about team building and management. My past self would be shocked. I mean, I come from more of an artistic background. I'm really interested in building product design. I would have thought maybe, I don't know, integrating LLMs to really the tactile piece of it. But a couple years into Clearbit, I learned a few things. And this is the team. We look very young. A couple years in, this is some of the product team. And things are going really well. Our business did $1 million in sales in the first year, then we tripled that, then we doubled that. Things were going incredibly well, and the engineering team was top-notch. Our product was something that I was really proud of, but at the same time, I was really at my lowest point, to be honest. And that was really because I was the solo PM for 5 engineering pods, plus doing my exec duties. I was taking a lot of shortcuts just to make ends meet. Was incredibly burnt out and working really long hours. And of course, the first thing that went was customer meetings, right? So I stopped talking to our customers as regularly. It was really quite bad, and it felt like we were kind of balanced on this house of cards, and I was the only person that maybe saw that was happening. And really, the bigger problem was I wasn't making the shift that the company needed from me. When you first start a company, there's this critical challenge, I think, that all operator founders face, which is they're really good at building a product. That's why they're there. But really quickly, with any success, the job shifts to building a team, to cultivating great talent, to building an environment that drives outcomes. And it makes sense that that's hard for most founders because it's really scary. You're having to give up some of the things that you're so good at, give up control, and it's a totally different skill set. And one of the biggest mistakes that I made kind of early was I hadn't made that jump. And so thankfully I had all these people around me that are crazy talented and gave me very honest, critical feedback. And so for the last 6 years, I've been really focused on just that problem. Thankfully, we have great executive coaches. We we sold into some of the best tech product orgs on the planet, and so I had this network of incredible product leaders that I could draw from. And so thankfully we turned that corner, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the things that I've learned from that and from working with a lot of great early tech founders to kind of turn that corner themselves. Specifically, what I wanted to talk about was kind of once you get past this drunk walk of finding product fit and really scaling out the team and getting ready for hypergrowth. So hopefully this is useful to folks who are just getting started and also folks who run product teams today. Okay, one thing I actually just added this because I've been asked this a lot this trip, which is just who's the first person hire? Okay, we've got product fit. We're feeling pretty good about this. How do I think about hiring out my first PM? And that kind of leads me to maybe the first controversial statement, which is I don't actually think you should hire somebody really senior at the beginning. Generally speaking, that causes a lot of problems because your founders are really the head of product early on, and you don't need another vision person. And so I look for people who are kind of, oh, you okay? Did we go out? No? Who are a few years in their career, who come from a very solid PM program. I generally, for the first one, this isn't always true, but generally go for generalists over specialists. And then it's kind of good PM practice, right? People who are curious, ask a lot of questions. I always go for raw horsepower and drive over built skills and folks who are great communicators. At Clearbit, the number one indicator of success was someone's ability to hold a tremendous amount of context and see connections between problems. And that goes for both engineers and product folks. And there are ways to test for that. Perhaps in QA we can talk about it. But that's generally what I look for. And then after that first one, we're trying to hire as diversely as possible. Everybody's probably seen this little Venn diagram at some point or another. Nobody can do all of these things. And so for me, what it takes to really build a great product team are people that can, as a group, fill in those three circles. And my job then as a product leader is to build an environment that can draw from the strengths of everyone. Now, I've worked with PMs, I've hired PMs from Google and Facebook and who come from tiny startups or who have never done product before and come from a data science background or a demand gen background. And so you're really wanting to draw from all of that. But let's jump in a little bit. There's a wonderful SaaS leader named Molly Graham who coined this phrase that you may have heard, which is giving up your Legos. And this is kind of what I was talking about. It's as a business scales, you necessarily have to go from really broad context to narrow and deep and hand off responsibilities. And a lot of people just simply aren't ready for that. So what happens when sort of founders don't take that leap of faith? Well, they end up with a lot of Legos, which I guess is kind of cool. But generally, it leads to micromanagement, which this is actually kind of funny. I had a little fun with Midjourney on this, but does anybody worry that this is... I literally just typed in micromanagement, and this is the image that came up? I don't, anyway. Quickly, teams get disengaged, and that leads to a whole mess of process that nobody really wants. You know, there's that old joke about salespeople being coin-operated. No offense to any salespeople here. Product teams are autonomy or agency operated, and as soon as you start removing that, you get significantly worse work. Creativity generally, and that's kind of what I'm interested in, is how do you build creativity at scale. Out of abundance is always better than creativity out of scarcity. When people are scared, they're not curious, they don't ask why, and that's kind of the only job that product managers has, is to ask why a bunch. And so when you, so the question then is, how do you create a team that is driven, that is open, and and let's kind of start with the process side, what not to do. I'm sure that there's a product leader in the room that will give me a hard time for this later. But the first lesson we learned was that that too much process early will kill progress. I worked with an executive that had come from a large public company to a 100-person startup, and we were talking about this meeting that he has where his team presented their metrics every week. And I said, well, how do you do that? And he said, well, at the beginning of the week, I meet with my team and we decide what we're going to do. Then throughout the rest of the week, I meet with them each individually and decide, help them figure out what they're going to say. Then an hour before the meeting, I hold the same meeting so that we can practice. And then I hold the meeting. And then I start over. And I said, that's a ton of meetings for what should be a dashboard. And he said, well, this is all theater anyway, isn't it? And that's about the time I flipped the table over. Because you just, those processes that may work at large organizations just do not work when you're scaling. And you're kind of playing their game, and you're going to lose at it. So what do you do then in order to avoid this process bloat, which is very natural, particularly as you suddenly add 15 people to the team? I like to call it minimum viable product process, which really follows the same. I think about process at a company the same way that you think about building the product itself. And this wasn't always the case. The first process doc that we produced at Clearbit was 21 pages long and got me yelled at by, I think, our 6 PMs at the time. But this doesn't mean that there's no process, right? There's lots of great places to implement process. Of course you want it at cross-functional comms. Of course you want it with resourcing, prioritization, those types of things. But what it is that generally heavy process would be the very last thing you do in order to solve a problem. I think about building the operating system of your team the same way that you're building products, right? You pick a very specific goal you're trying to solve, and you do the absolute minimum that you need to solve it completely, and then you iterate. The biggest thing is building a culture of flexibility. If people expect that there's going to be a lot of change, a lot of iteration in your culture, it's not a problem anymore. If you have very rigid structures and then you start changing them, suddenly people start losing their minds. So really it's expectation management of all things. So the question then is, okay, well, if you don't have heavy process, like what do you do to make sure that people are running in the same direction? Which I'd argue, again, is kind of the main job of a product leader, is you point people in the right direction and you create an environment that they can be creative to achieve those goals. That's kind of it. And so there's a few things that I would say that are kind of do most of the heavy lifting here. And they will not be at all unheard of to anyone who's worked in this business. But I will tell you, when I work with smaller startups who are just getting into this phase, and there's problems, 90% of the time, it's this. Setting a clear vision and strategy, a way to test it. First of all, it needs to be written down. And a way to test it is write it down, hand it to 5 people who aren't familiar with your business. If they all say the same thing, you're probably in a pretty good zone. When we first started Clearbit, we did this with the executive team, and we all thought we were aligned. But as with, shooting an arrow a couple degrees off, over time it drifts, and we realized that, yeah, generally that was correct, but once we did this exercise, we realized we were actually quite a ways off. And then everything kind of falls out of that. From vision, you set your goals. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because, I don't know, there's lots of articles on on goal setting. What I will say is that for B2B SaaS, and kind of my neck of the woods, I usually recommend that folks start with retention. Because sales can sell things that don't exist. CS can't retain if the product doesn't over-deliver. And frankly, that was a hard one and very simple lesson. But really, everything that your teams do as they scale comes from that. And goals lead to team structure. So I think vertically integrated teams that are towards a specific goal ultimately mean that you need a hell of a lot less process behind the scenes in order to make things run smoothly. And the very last thing is, if what we've just done is said, okay, teams are largely run by kind of just creating a very defined goal, it's really then the principles that you build around how to think that give them the sandbox that they can be creative within. And so this is from Linear, which is doing really well by stripping a lot of the process out of product development. But here's a couple examples, right? So build for creators. Keeping individuals productive is more important than generating perfect reports. That is a very, very actionable principle that people, if they're deciding what to build, can leverage. Okay, so we got through that. The third lesson that I learned along the way is around feedback. And the question really I have is, how do you keep people comfortable with failing? Creativity, again, happens in abundance. People can't be scared, and so often we hit them with very specific targets that make it a little bit scary. And so feedback is really central to how we did things at Clearbit, and we're probably pretty crazy on this. One of the things we did was, as an executive team, cross-functionally, we gave each other really intense feedback written, and then we released that to the whole company. So they could see us being very critical of one another and in a helpful way and understand that that's a gift. We stopped doing that at about 150, 200 people. And people who were there beforehand, it had a market effect on, actually. We hired coaches to show up and teach conflict resolution and how to give feedback, and most importantly, how to take feedback without being reactive. And every single week, we gave every single manager and report, we give bi-directional feedback. I think in an effective product org, if your team stays quiet, your product will suffer. They really need to know that you take feedback well, and then they can agree or disagree, but commit to decisions that are reached. But I don't know that we could have done what we did without the feedback model that we had. So this one's actually really important. The lesson 4 that I learned was that the best product work is done in public. We made sure that everything at the company that product folks were working on was written down and worked on very much in public. Anyone could come check it out, as long as there wasn't anything proprietary that for some reason we didn't want to show. But the vast majority of things were out there. And I had a PM come to me once that he'd come from Google, and he did what was called a product crit, which is like a design crit, so a design critique, where traditionally designers would bring things that they're working on and get feedback. Well, in the product crit, what we ended up doing was, and I told him, great, run it. And every week, our PMs would sign up. They would talk about whatever they were working on at the time. They had some crazy idea that they had. It did not need to be at all concrete, but it did need to be written down and sent ahead of time. That single meeting was probably the most productive thing that we did as an organization, because really what it leads to is you have all of these incredible individuals who are working cross-functionally, and it came from all these different backgrounds on the product team, and that's how you leverage their shared skills. I had one guy who was sort of an expert in no-code, right? Hacking together little systems. He was not a technical dude, but he can make just about anything with Retool and Zapier, et cetera. And he showed up, he had one day with this system that he'd built. He'd heard that a customer wanted a thing, and so he connected Zapier, he wrote a couple scripts, and he took our data, he manipulated it, he sent it into their systems, and he did all this in about a day. And in less than a week, he had 3 customers up on alphas, and before he'd even gotten engineering involved, and then he went and got them to spec everything out. It was the easiest green light I've ever had. And suddenly all of the other PMs were working in that fashion as well. And so it was an incredible place where you don't have to set the specific rhythm of each org. The kind of proof is in the pudding. It happens on its own. I think this is maybe the last one. And the last one is FaceTime pays dividends. What we used to do as a product org is we had a pretty distributed team even before COVID. And what we found was that when folks are working over Zoom, I don't know if you all have found the same thing, very quickly people start treating each other just based on kind of what they need from one another. It's very direct. It's, hey, this is Adam, he's my PMM API, right? That's what I need. When I need PMM work, I go to him. This is Julie, she is my customer success API. What happens very quickly when you don't have a more human connection is that when things go wrong, trust fails, people put in processes to make, because they don't believe that other teams are doing what they're doing. And that just absolutely shuts down productivity. So what we actually did was every single quarter we would fly every single member out for a week. Not at the same time, they would just come in. We would also do several offsites for the whole company. But this little chart here is my approximation of productivity kind of at the point where they come out and then throughout the quarter. And what you'd see is like from the baseline state, they come, they go home, productivity's great, it slowly trails off, and then it bumps back up. And part of that is that they're more connected, part of that is that they learn to treat each other as human beings rather than APIs, but it is incredibly important. And I would say as a startup, even when you're cash-strapped, it is absolutely worth paying a not insignificant percentage of your free cash flow to get people together if you're not an in-person team. I know others will disagree, but and the last one, despite everything that we were saying, as a founder, as an early team member, you have to set the bar. Ultimately, no one is going to care about this as much as you do at that time, if it's your team, if it's your company. And what is incredibly hard is resetting a bar once it's gone down. And so in terms of quality, it's, A quality begets A quality, B quality begets C quality. It's kind of the same as people talk about with hiring. You got to decide what's necessary for you and then uphold it. And you have to clear it yourself. That's the first step. But I think, like, in terms of, ultimately, what's our job as a founder or as somebody who's growing a product team at the beginning? It's really, as with much of company building, people like to overcomplicate things. It's not actually that complicated. It's fairly simple, but it is very hard. And so really kind of, especially in the early days, getting out of one's way, setting very concrete, very definable, very measurable goals, and then giving your team a space to be creative in yields by far the best results. And ultimately, it's your job to make sure that the outcomes are held to a high standard. That's all I've got. Thank you all for listening. I'm going to head over to the Q&A stage if anybody wants to talk shop, but thank you.